The ink on the resolution had not even dried when Gren Solis smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that powerful people wear when they believe they have just reminded someone smaller of their place. He stood at the center of the Grand Council chamber on Velorum 9, his pale ridge scales catching the blue ambient light from above, and he let the moment sit. Around him, in the curved tiered seats that rose in layers toward the ceiling, representatives from 41 species watched in silence. Most of them had voted to abstain, not because they disagreed with humanity, not because they thought the resolution was fair. They abstained because Gren Solis had spent 3 months reminding every delegation that the Tarvith controlled 6 of the 9 main supply routes through the outer belt, and that supply routes had a way of becoming unreliable when the Tarvith were unhappy. The resolution was simple on paper. Humanity's trade corridor access would be reclassified. Their demilitarized zone protections would be suspended pending a review that had no defined end date. The stated reason was that humans were, in the official language of the document, too historically volatile for full, unrestricted galactic membership privileges. The real reason was that humanity had found something valuable under the rock of Hessa colony, and the Tarvith wanted it. Rael Doran sat at the human delegation table on the left side of the chamber floor and did not move. He was not a large man. He had silver hair cut short, and a face that had spent decades learning to show nothing when showing nothing mattered most. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him. His eyes tracked the vote count on the display screen above the chamber floor as it climbed toward the threshold. The final number appeared. The resolution passed by 31 votes. 2 species had voted against. One was a small aquatic delegation from the Mevari, who had always been openly sympathetic to humanity. The other was Councillor Des of the Orani, whose 4 broad arms were folded across his chest in a posture that his species used when they were deeply displeased. He had voted no without explanation. He would not give one. Gren Solis turned to the chamber and spread his long fingers wide in the Tarvith gesture of formal acknowledgement. He said that the council had spoken with wisdom. He said that this was a decision in the interest of galactic stability. He said it slowly, so everyone could hear him enjoy saying it. Nobody moved to challenge him. Then Rael Doran stood up. He did not ask for the floor loudly. He simply rose and walked to the central podium with the calm of a man who had already decided exactly what he was going to say and how many words he was going to use to say it. The chamber went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Before, it had been the quiet of people avoiding attention. Now it was the quiet of people paying attention. Rael placed both hands on the edge of the podium and looked up at the chamber. He said he understood the vote. He said he would not waste the council's time arguing against a decision already made. He said that in the full recorded history of humanity's galactic presence, Earth had never fired the first shot in any conflict. Not once. He said he believed that record was worth mentioning. Then he said the last thing he was going to say, and he said it the same way he had said everything else, quietly and without expression. He said that Earth had also never lost. He thanked the chamber, picked up his documents, and walked back to his seat. Gren Solis leaned toward the aide beside him and said, loud enough to carry, that diplomats from dying empires always gave memorable last speeches. Several species in the galleries above made sounds that translated roughly to nervous laughter. Councillor Des made no sound at all. He was watching Rael Doran, who had sat back down and was now organizing his papers with the focused attention of a man preparing for his next meeting, not staring at Gren, not scanning the room, just working. Des had lived a long time. He had seen many species pass through the Grand Council chamber. He had learned to read the difference between a person who was angry and a person who was already 3 steps ahead. Rael Doran was not angry. That was the part that made Des's 4-chambered heart beat harder than it should. Across the chamber, near the back wall where aides and observers stood in a long line, A small feathered figure named Sova watched Rael with wide eyes. Sova worked for Gren Solus, had worked for him for 6 years, had seen him maneuver greater species than humanity into corners before, had watched him win every time. But Sova had also read Earth's history files. All of them. From the early wars on their own planet to the expansion era skirmishes to the Carven incident 40 years ago, where a mining consortium had made the mistake of firing on a human survey team and found out what happened next. Gren thought he had just won something. Sova thought Gren had just started a clock. The chamber moved on to the next item on the agenda. The blue lights hummed. The curved white walls carried the voices of 41 species talking about trade and borders and policy. Rael Doran sat quietly and read his documents. Outside the station, in the long dark between stars, nothing had happened yet. But the clock was running. The dust on Hessa colony never fully settled. It was not wind that kept it moving. It was the underground vibrations from the mineral extraction rigs that ran 20 hours a day beneath the colony's outer processing zones. The colonists had learned to live with it. Children born on Hessa had a habit of touching walls and floors with their palms, feeling the low hum under the rock, the way their parents had once touched the ground back on Earth to feel whether rain was coming. Yara Doran had been stationed on Hessa for 4 months. She knew the hum. She knew the dust. She knew that when the vibration stopped at odd hours, it meant either a rig had hit a hard vein or something above the surface had gone wrong. The vibration stopped at hour 14 of her shift. 3 seconds later, her comm channel opened, and Win Carr's voice came through, with the specific kind of calm that people use when they are deciding whether to be afraid. He said there were 3 ships that had not been on any approach registry. He said they were Tarvith configuration. He said they had just opened fire on the convoy he had been escorting through the corridor, and that he needed ground to know right now. Yara was already moving before he finished the sentence. She pulled her unit together in the time it took most people to find their boots. 6 soldiers, light gear, fast. She sent 2 to the eastern perimeter of the processing zone and took the other 4 with her toward the outer landing pads, where the mineral storage units sat in rows under a sky the color of pale copper. Win was still transmitting from above. He lost 1 escort ship in the first exchange. He pulled the other 2 out of the kill zone using the debris field from a hit convoy module as cover. His fighter had taken a strike to the rear stabilizer and was handling like something angry and injured, but he kept it in the air and kept talking. He said 8 of them ground-dropped, moving toward the storage. Yara saw them at the same moment he said it. 8 figures in Tarvith privateer gear moving between the outer storage columns. They were not being careful about noise. They had calculated correctly that a small colony defense unit was not going to be a serious obstacle. That calculation was wrong. Yara's unit moved through the dust in a pattern that did not announce itself. No shouting, no warning shots. She had studied the storage zone layout for 2 months out of basic professional habit, and she used every meter of it. 2 of her soldiers came from the left side behind the second row of storage units. 1 came high from the processing platform above. Yara and the remaining 2 came straight through the middle from the shadow of the largest unit at the far end. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. 2 Tarvith privateers were captured. The rest retreated to their drop shuttle and lifted off hard and fast. 1 of Yara's soldiers had a cut across the forearm from a piece of shrapnel. Yara herself had taken a hit to her left shoulder that was going to be an ugly bruise for a week, but had not broken anything. She stood in the dust after the shuttle disappeared and breathed. Wynn brought his damaged fighter down to the Hessa landing pad 17 minutes later. He climbed out of the cockpit and walked over to where Yara was finishing her incident report on a hand terminal. He looked at the captured privateers being processed by 2 of her unit. He looked at the storage units, untouched. He looked at the sky where the Tarvith ships had been. He said, They hid us in a corridor that just lost its protections 2 days ago." Yara said, "Yes." He said, "That is not a coincidence." She said no. He asked her what happened next. She finished the last line of her incident report. Then she opened a separate encrypted channel and typed a short message to her father. She did not explain the attack. She did not list casualties or describe the engagement. She wrote 7 words. "It has started. They moved first, Hessa." She sent it and put the terminal in her jacket. Above them, in the copper-colored sky, Wind's damaged fighter sat cooling on the landing pad with a hole in its rear stabilizer and a scorched line across the left wing that had not been there this morning. One of the convoy ships was still drifting in the corridor above, its power systems dark, 3 crew members in emergency suits waiting for recovery. The mineral rig started up again beneath the colony, and the dust began to drift, and Hessa made its familiar hum. On Velorum 9, in a chamber with blue lights and curved white walls, nobody had received Yara's message yet. But Rael Doran's terminal was already lit. He read the 7 words. He sat with them for a moment. Then he picked up a different channel and made a call that had nothing to do with diplomacy. The ultimatum arrived at every council member world simultaneously. Not through the standard diplomatic relay, which could take hours to route through Velorum 9, and which Gren Solis had learned to slow down when it suited him. Earth had transmitted directly to every species' primary government frequency at the same moment, bypassing the Council's communication infrastructure entirely. That alone made several delegations uncomfortable before they had even read the text. The message was not long. It stated that Tarvath-aligned forces had attacked a human civilian convoy and attempted to seize human colonial property on Hessa. It stated that this action had occurred within 48 hours of the Grand Council removing the protections that would have prevented exactly this. It did not use the word coincidence. It stated that Earth required full restoration of all corridor and zone protections, formal acknowledgement of responsibility, and reparations paid directly to Hessa Colony, and that Earth was giving the Grand Council 72 hours to begin this process before Earth addressed the matter through other means. It was signed by Earth's government with no additional language. Gren Solis read it in his private office on Velorum 9 with Sova and 2 senior advisors standing near the far wall. He read it once. Then he set it down and said that this was exactly what he had expected. He said humans always made noise when they were afraid. He said the 72 hours would pass, nothing would happen, and Hessa's minerals would belong to Tarvath-contracted operations within the month. His advisors agreed. They listed reasons. They cited historical patterns of human political hesitation. They mentioned internal divisions in Earth's government. They built a comfortable structure out of assumptions and stood inside it. Sova stood near the wall and said nothing. That evening Sova went to the station's archive terminal and pulled up every documented instance of Earth issuing a formal ultimatum in its history. There were 11. In every single case the deadline had been genuine. In every single case, the action that followed had been proportional, prepared, and immediate. Sova sat with that information until the station's night cycle began. Then Sova copied several Tarvath internal military assessment files onto a personal data chip and put the chip in a pocket. 72 hours later, at the exact moment Earth's deadline expired with no response from the Council, Admiral Bowen was sitting in the command chair of a ship called the Ardent. He was reading a supply manifest. He closed the manifest. He looked at the tactical display. He said one sentence to his communications officer. The communications officer opened the all-frequencies channel and read the prepared notice of action to every inhabited system within range of their signal, which was most of the inhabited galaxy. The notice named the Tarvath. Only the Tarvath. It stated that Earth was moving to address the Hessa incident through direct action against the responsible party, and that any species choosing to involve themselves in support of that party would be treated as a combatant. Then the fleet moved. It was not the fleet the Council had imagined when they thought about human military capability. The Council had seen Earth's patrol vessels and diplomatic escorts and the handful of warships that had been present at joint exercises over the years. Those were real, but they were the part of Earth's military designed to be seen. The rest had been built quietly over decades in orbital yards that did not appear on public registries, crewed by people who understood that on the most dangerous planet in the known galaxy, the species that survived longest were not the ones who showed everything they had. There were carrier wings whose pilots had trained since childhood in atmospheric conditions that would have killed most other species on contact. There were fast strike ships built low and narrow that could change direction at speeds the Tarvath targeting systems had not been calibrated to track. There were logistics chains that could sustain operations at distance longer than any Tarvath campaign planner had calculated as physically possible. And there were the support ships, which looked unremarkable from a distance, and which carried inside them enough materials to rebuild a colony or a fleet, whichever became necessary first. Across Council space, alien governments received the notice of action and held emergency sessions. The reactions varied. A Mevari government official began drafting a letter of support for Earth and was advised by his staff to wait and see. A species called the Drovian, who had significant trade ties with the Tarvath, issued a declaration of complete neutrality within 4 hours and began moving their commercial ships out of the contested corridor. Others followed. Species after species withdrew to a safe political distance, with a speed that suggested they had been watching Rael Doran's face in the council chamber more carefully than Gren Solis had. On Velorum 9, Councillor Des stood at the viewport in his private quarters and read the notice of action on his personal screen. He read it twice. He had voted against the resolution. He had tried. The record would show that. He set the screen down and looked out at the stars, and said quietly to the empty room that he had tried to tell them. Outside in the dark between systems, in the silence that exists before things change permanently, the Ardent led the fleet forward at a pace that was unhurried and exact. Bowen had gone back to his supply manifest. There was nothing more to do right now. The plan was already running. The Tarvath battle station Voroskal had never been attacked in its 40-year operational history. It sat at the edge of Tarvath frontier space like a flat, dark hand spread open against the stars, its 6 docking arms extended, its weapons arrays running their standard rotation cycle. The crew of 1100 had run drills. They had protocols. They had a commanding officer named Drev who had served on 3 other stations and never once fired a weapon in actual combat. Drev was in the middle of a shift briefing when his sensor operator said the words that ended that record. The strike wing came in from a direction Voroskal's long-range sensors had classified as empty space. It was not empty space. It was a position that human navigators had spent 2 weeks reaching in stages, each stage too small to register as a military approach, each pause timed to match the natural signal interference patterns of the local asteroid field. By the time Voroskal's systems understood what they were looking at, Winkar's wing was already inside the station's optimal response window. Win had a list of targets, not areas, not general systems, specific components on specific sections of the station's exterior. The list had been built by engineers back on Earth who had studied Tarvath Station construction for 20 years because that is what Earth's intelligence services did in peacetime. Study, catalog, prepare. He hit the first target and it went dark. He hit the second and the station's long-range communication array folded. He hit the third and fourth in sequence with 2 other pilots covering his run, and Voroskal's propulsion system went from operational to inert in less than 90 seconds. The station did not explode. The crew did not die. The weapons arrays went offline because their targeting power relay was on the list. And a targeting array without power is just metal in space. Wynn pulled his wing back and held position. Voroskal drifted. Inside the station, Drev stood in the sudden quiet of a command center running on emergency lighting and tried to process what had just happened. His communication systems were down. His weapons were offline. His engines were cold. His crew was alive and uninjured. The humans had come in, taken apart his station with what appeared to be a very specific shopping list, and left. They had not tried to board. They had not broadcast threats. They had not destroyed anything that was not on whatever list they were working from. Drev was a military man. He understood what it meant when an enemy had the capability to destroy you and chose not to. It did not mean they were being kind. It meant they had already decided you were not a threat worth the cost of the ammunition. He found that significantly more frightening than if they had simply blown the station apart. On the ground side of the same frontier, Yara's unit had pushed out from Hessa Colony into the contested corridor zones with 4 other defense teams in a coordinated sweep. They were not advancing to seize territory. They were advancing to hold what was already human by treaty that the Council had suspended, but that Earth had not agreed to consider suspended. The distinction mattered legally. It also mattered practically, because it meant Yara's forces were not attacking anything that wasn't already being used to threaten them. They encountered 2 more privateer units in the corridor zones over 3 days. Both broke contact quickly when they realized the human forces were not the small colonial defense units the privateers had been briefed to expect. Yara filed clean reports after each engagement. She noted the time, the contact, the resolution. She wrote in factual language with no emotional decoration. Her shoulder was still bruised, and she had begun doing her morning stretches slightly crooked, but she did not put that in the report. Back on Velorum 9, Gren Solis had stopped making dismissive remarks. He was in the council chamber again, not at the podium this time but in his delegation seat, pushing hard for a collective response. He used the word aggression several times. He used the phrase galactic stability twice. He said that if the Council allowed Earth to act this way without unified opposition, every species would be at risk. He had been saying versions of this for 2 days. Councilor Des had been listening for 2 days. When Des finally spoke, the chamber went quiet the way it had when Rael Doran had spoken, which was a comparison not lost on some of the older delegates. Des said that the Council needed to be careful with the word aggression. He said Earth had named one party, only one. He said Earth's forces had disabled military assets without killing personnel, which was a restraint that suggested a defined operational plan rather than an emotional response. He said that if the Council voted to intervene collectively, they would be inserting themselves into a conflict that was currently limited and making themselves a named party in it. He paused. He looked at Gren Solis. He said that he had spent the last 48 hours modeling what an Earth at full war against the whole Council would look like. He said he was not going to read the conclusions in open chamber, because doing so would cause immediate panic. But he said that anyone in the room who believed the current situation was worse than that situation was welcome to push for the vote. Nobody pushed for the vote. Gren Solis sat back in his chair, and the confidence he had worn like a second layer of scales for 20 years looked, for the first time, like it did not fit him quite right. Sova watched from the side wall and thought about the data chip in her pocket. Tomorrow she would deliver it. The ceasefire request came through a back channel that Gren Solis had used for quiet political deals for 15 years. It was a channel that officially did not exist, routed through a Tarvith commercial shipping registry, and then through 2 neutral relay systems before arriving at whatever terminal Gren needed it to reach. He had used it to pressure smaller species into favorable votes. He had used it to make problems disappear before they reached open council session. He had used it to build the machinery that had made him the most powerful speaker the Grand Council had seen in a generation. He used it now to ask humanity for a ceasefire. The reply came back within the hour. Earth agreed, conditionally. The conditions were the same ones Rael Doran had read in the original ultimatum: full restoration of protections, reparations to Hessa colony, formal acknowledgement entered into galactic record, a face-to-face session before the full council to make it official. Gren had hoped the back channel would allow him to settle this quietly, without a public session, without a formal record. He had hoped that Earth wanted this over quickly enough to accept a private resolution that could be characterized later in whatever way suited both parties. The reply made clear that Earth did not want it characterized in any way. Earth wanted it recorded. Sova delivered the data chip to Rael Doran's aide that same morning. Rael read the contents in 40 minutes. The Tarvith internal assessment showed that Gren had known before the resolution vote that the corridor protections being removed would create the conditions for exactly what happened at Hessa. The assessment papers had been written by Tarvith strategic planners. They used careful language, but the logic was clear. Remove the protections. Wait for the colonists to resist pressure. Allow the privateers to act. Claim instability. Assert Tarvith interests in the name of stability. It was a plan that had worked on 4 other species over 20 years. Rael placed the chip in his document case and went to prepare for the council session. The chamber on Velorum 9 was full. That was unusual. Council sessions on difficult matters often saw thin attendance, delegates sending aides in their place to avoid being on record for uncomfortable votes. Today, every delegation had sent its senior representative. Several species that rarely attended in person had made the journey to the station specifically for this session. The galleries above were packed with observers. They all wanted to see what Rael Doran looked like when he came back. He walked in from the human delegation entrance, alone, carrying his document case. He wore the same standard diplomatic suit he had worn at every session Rael had attended. He nodded to the chamber attendant who held the door. He sat at the human delegation table and opened his case. When his name was called to the floor, he walked to the central podium the same way he had walked to it before, without hurry, without performance. He read Earth's terms. He did not editorialize them. He did not explain them or argue for them. He read them the way you read a set of facts that do not require your opinion to be true. When he finished, Gren Solis began speaking from his seat. He raised procedural questions about the format of the terms. He asked whether reparations could be paid through a council fund rather than directly to Hessa. He suggested that the formal acknowledgement language be reviewed by a subcommittee before entering the record. He spoke at length. Rael stood at the podium and waited. He did not respond to the procedural questions. He did not argue. He stood with both hands on the podium edge and waited with the patience of a man who had already understood that the other side of a negotiation running out of real options will fill silence with noise. Gren ran through his procedures one by one. Each time he stopped, Rael was still there, still waiting, not impatient, not satisfied, just present. After the 4th procedural attempt, Counselor Des raised one of his 4 arms and asked in a quiet voice whether the chamber was prepared to vote on the terms as presented. The vote passed with 33 in favor. Gren Solis voted yes. He did it in the specific mechanical way of a person who has made a calculation and accepted its outcome and decided not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing how it cost him. Rael gathered his documents. He paused for one moment before stepping away from the podium, and he looked up at the full gallery above. Not at any one delegate, just up, taking in the room the way you take in a room when you want to remember exactly what it looked like. Then he walked back to his table. In the gallery, Sova watched him and thought about the data chip. Rael had never mentioned it during the session. He had not used it. He had not needed to use it. The chip was there in his case if the vote had gone differently. A guaranteed record of Gren's premeditation that would have made the session something much more serious than a vote on terms. He had brought it as a backup. He had not needed the backup. Sova folded her small, feathered hands together and thought about what kind of person prepares a winning hand in full and then wins the game before ever needing to show it. Outside the station, the trade corridor sat waiting, quiet, the same dark space it had always been. In a few days it would have ships in it again. For now it was simply there, and the stars were unchanged, and the chamber was filing out, and Rael Doran was repacking his document case with the same careful attention he gave to every task, large or small. On Hessa Colony, the repair crews worked in 2 shifts, so the dome habitats were never left without someone checking the seals. It was a small thing, a practical thing, the kind of decision that came naturally to people who had built their lives on a world that required constant attention. Hessa was not an easy place. The rock was hard, the sun was pale and distant, and the dust that came up from the extraction rigs settled on everything and had to be cleared from ventilation filters every 3rd day or they clogged. The colonists did not talk much about what had happened. They noted it the way people note things that confirm what they already knew about the universe, that safety required maintenance, that the galaxy noticed you when you had something worth taking, that it was useful to know who had your back and who was calculating whether you were worth the trouble. Yara stood at the eastern perimeter of the colony 3 weeks after the ceasefire and watched a repair team patch the outer wall of the 2nd storage unit. The scorch mark from the raiding party's retreat was still faintly visible under the new sealant layer. The team was working without hurry. They were singing something, low and off-key, the way people sing when they are not performing for anyone. Wynne came up beside her without announcing himself. He stood for a moment watching the same repair crew. He had his jacket open despite the cold and his hands in his pockets, in the way of someone who had recently stopped being tense and was not quite sure yet what to do with the absence of it. He said, "I heard your father was back on Earth." She said, "He is." He said, "Did you talk to him?" She said, "He sent a message. He said the record is in. The formal acknowledgement is sitting in the council archive under the permanent index." Wynne nodded slowly. He looked at the scorch mark under the new sealant. He said, "They actually put it in writing." She said, "He does not accept things that are not in writing." Wynne was quiet for a moment. Then he said that when the privateer ships had come through the corridor and hit the convoy, his first thought had not been tactical. His first thought had been that nothing was going to come of it, that the council would issue a statement, and the Turvith would pay a fine that meant nothing to them, and the corridor would stay unprotected, and Hessa would keep waking up not knowing if today was the day it happened again. He said he had been wrong about that. Yara did not say anything. She already knew. The ceremony on Earth was held in a room inside the Defense Assembly Building that had no windows. This was not an oversight. The room had been used for quiet acknowledgments for over a century because the people who designed it understood that some things did not need light coming in from outside. They had their own weight, and that was enough. Yara and Wynne sat in the 2 chairs in the center of the room. A senior officer of Earth's Unified Command stood before them and read 2 short commendations from a physical document held in both hands. The language was formal and exact. It listed what had been done, not what it had cost. The decorations were placed with care. There was no audience, no press, no broadcast of any kind. The senior officer shook their hands, said something brief and genuine to each of them, and left the room. Yara and Wynne sat for a moment in the quiet. He said, "That's it." She said, "That's it." He thought about this. Then he said he had expected something larger. She said that her father had told her once that the species that celebrated wars the loudest were usually the ones that needed to convince themselves the cost had been worth it. She said that Earth did not celebrate them. It closed them. Wynne looked at the decoration in his hand. He turned it over once and put it in his jacket pocket. He said, "Fair enough." On Velorum 9, Counselor Des sent a private message to Rael Doran's personal terminal. He wrote that he had been in council work for 30 years and that he had watched many conflicts begin and end. He wrote that he had rarely seen a species manage the distance between cause and response the way humanity had in this situation. He asked a genuine question. He asked how Earth had maintained that control throughout. The reply came back the next day. It was short. Rael wrote that it was a question people often asked, and that the usual assumption behind it was that human discipline came from being peaceful. He wrote that this was not correct. He wrote that Earth's people had spent most of their history at war with each other, which meant they understood war in ways that species with cleaner histories did not. He wrote that control did not come from having no anger. It came from having a plan that mattered more than the anger. And when the plan was clear, everything else became secondary. He wrote that Gren Solis had made the mistake of thinking restraint was absence. He wrote it is not absence, it is direction. Des read it twice and then saved it to his personal archive. Gren Solis was removed from his position as council speaker 4 months later by a Tarvith internal review body that concluded his judgment in the Hessa matter had cost them considerably more than any gain from the resolution could have justified. He did not contest the removal. He retired to a private residence and was rarely heard from again. The trade corridor reopened on a quiet Tuesday local station time. No ceremony, no announcement. The shipping registries updated to reflect the restored protections, and the first convoy moved through as scheduled. Somewhere in the Council's central archive, in a file that any species could access if they knew where to look, there was a new entry in the permanent record. It contained the formal acknowledgement of responsibility, the reparations agreement, and one line of contextual notation added by the archive clerk, whose job it was to summarize the matter for future reference. The notation read, "Matter resolved following human military response to corridor attack. Full terms accepted by responsible party. All protections restored." Below that, in the clerk's own small handwriting in the margin of the physical copy, which no one ever officially read but which archivists sometimes added, because they had been doing this job long enough to feel things deserved to be said, were 4 words. They should have known.